Hello, I'm Alison Hargreaves from guidesforbrides.co.uk, and this evening we are looking at these new law reform reviews. And this is something we've been waiting for a very, very long time. It started in 2015. We and many others have been involved in the discussions right from the beginning, so it is lovely to finally see those policies going out there, and also seeing that the Law Commission really did listen to all of the feedback that they were offered along the way. So time frame wise, this is probably the most important thing. These at the moment are now the formal recommendations that are going to government. So the government had asked the Law Commission to look into potential changes to the law. The government now will be looking at what happens next, what they agree with, what they perhaps don't agree with, any areas that need a little bit of consideration. They have 6 months in order to publish their initial thoughts, and a further 6 months to give their full thoughts on it. It then has to be passed by law. So don't expect this to be affecting weddings later on this year, and probably not weddings next year either. It's really starting to look at weddings in 2024 would be our guess. And of course, in some cases, the government will look at the suggestions and say, no, we're quite happy as we are. We are not for 1 minute thinking that that's going to happen. Because what we know is the government had asked for this because the law was so outdated. So the marriage laws go back to 1949, but a lot of the traditions that we follow and the rules and regulations are seated in what was happening in the 18th century, so really, really outdated. Now, the changes will just be affecting England and Wales, but it's bringing England and Wales much more up to date with the rest of the UK, so Scotland, Northern Ireland, as well as other countries. So we're not doing anything unusual. It's exactly, the proposals will be exactly as what is happening in places like New Zealand, Canada, Australia. So nothing unusual that's going to be going on. The changes that are being proposed are wide sweeping. It's looking at the preliminary paperwork, modernising that, the actual ceremony, giving a huge amount more choice and freedom for that ceremony, and also the registration afterwards, the most important bit. And one of the things that the law reform is seeking to do is making sure that all of that is simplified, because they don't want any barriers in the way of weddings. This is really, really good news for our industry. But they also want to make sure that those who believe they've got married, the chances are they legally have, so simplifying everything. At the end of the process, what they hope to have achieved is freedom and a more modern way of getting married that suits couples, works better for venue suppliers, everyone else. They will have been looking throughout at retaining the dignity of marriage, but also making sure that they respect the religious organisations who are very keen to follow particular rules and rituals, and safeguarding that has been a very important part of it. Now, this evening, to discuss the implications and what we're going to be looking at, I have got Sophie Eaton will be joining me from the Association of Independent Celebrants. So I am just going conversation, and hopefully wobbly Wi-Fi. I think a lot of people are struggling with Wi-Fi today, but hopefully we will have Sophie with us now. Hi Sophie, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
So let's dive straight in to the question that I think everyone is going to be asking if they have a wedding in the next few years. Does this really mean they can get married absolutely anywhere and do whatever they're wanting? Are we going to be getting Las Vegas style weddings going on?
Well, there will be a lot more freedom in terms of where people can hold their ceremony. So, for example, they'll be opening up things like, if the government accepts the recommendations, they'll be opening up things like private homes, private gardens, beaches, parks, woodlands, fields, quite a wide range of locations. But what they're proposing, the Law Commission, if we are to move to this officiant-based system as opposed to the current buildings-based system, is that the onus would be on the regulated officiant to decide what a seemly and dignified location for a ceremony would be. So it doesn't necessarily mean that absolutely anything goes. The officiant would still have the same kind of responsibilities that a registrar currently has when they're deciding which premises to license for a civil wedding ceremony. So there will still be some restrictions in place, but they will be a lot more flexible, a lot more open.
And the person that can actually carry out that wedding, so can make that decision, can anyone get licensed? So could I go and get a license to be able to perform weddings in the future?
So what would happen is, if you wanted to be an independent officiant, then you would have to apply to the General Register Office in order to be given that license to conduct the wedding ceremony. So yes, technically anyone could apply to be an independent officiant, but they would have to go through quite a rigorous process in order to be licensed. So what you'll probably find is that it will be mostly people who are already operating as independent celebrants, and there are at least 1,000 independent wedding celebrants currently operating at the moment. But of course, we can't do the legal side of things at the moment. The couple has to do that separately. And what people will find, who have used independent celebrants themselves for their weddings, is that independent celebrants take their role very, very seriously. And they really do it out of love, and they create really personalized, beautiful ceremonies for couples. So what we'll probably find is that the people who apply to be officiants are people who are already doing it and have probably been doing it for years, but it will just enable them, if authorized, to do the legal side of the marriage as well.
And somebody has just commented that, quite correctly, that independent celebrants aren't really sort of focused on in the documentation, and that's because you'll be given a new title along with maritime officers who will be able to conduct ceremonies, and registrars. So all of those will be classified in exactly the same way as civil officiants, I believe. So yeah, absolutely right. There will no longer be the need for the term independent celebrant.
Yeah, so they do sort of refer to it as an independent officiant in the report, as opposed to an independent celebrant, because it would be an officiant-based system. So anybody who conducts a legally binding wedding would be known as an officiant rather than a celebrant. So they're separating the two types of weddings quite clearly into civil weddings and belief weddings. And so people who are currently working as humanist celebrants would fall into that belief category, and be humanist officiants. And people who are currently working as independent celebrants would fall into that civil category and work alongside registrars as independent civil officiants.
And just to very quickly address the question on humanist celebrants, this is something that there was a little bit of confusion, because partway through the consultation period, there were 6 couples that challenged the ruling on humanist ceremonies, and I believe that's going to be one of the details that is sorted later on. I know humanist celebrants at the moment carry out ceremonies. They have a much higher level of training than the training that's required for independent celebrants, who very much focus their time and energy just on the content of the wedding and personalising the wedding. So those sort of details are yet to be decided, and that's going to be a question for government to be looking at.
The government, absolutely. So the first question for government is whether they accept the recommendations, and then the second question will be, okay, well, who can be a registered officiant under these new rules?
But the important thing from the point of view of couples is the choice will be much, much greater, and the gist of everything that they're doing is making sure that anyone can celebrate their wedding, their marriage, in a way that is relevant and fitting to them. And the same will apply for those wanting to have a humanist ceremony. All of the important bits will be respected there. So important there. And one of the little anomalies that I think a lot of people picked up is the difference between registrars and I think it's just registrars who have their fees a little bit more fixed perhaps than independent celebrants and maritime officers, who can in theory charge whatever they like. Is that going to mean there's suddenly a hike in prices for for ceremonies, or will there be enough registrars, maritime officers and others, or enough independent celebrants to actually it will keep the prices down or possibly make it even more competitive for couples?
I believe it will probably stay about the same as what it currently is, because independent celebrants, if you look at the market as it is, independent celebrants are charging broadly the same as a registrar or a humanist celebrant. I would say the average is probably around £600 for a ceremony. Obviously, some will charge less and some will charge a bit more. But there will independent, if they go ahead with independent officiants, then they will be allowed to set their own fees. They won't be told that they have to cap it at a certain amount. But, you know, as you say, there'll be a lot of sort of comparison between different officiants and what different people are charging. So I don't believe that the prices will go sky high. I think they will probably stay broadly as they are.
And potentially that's very good news for the registrars that have found that they're caught on 0-hour contracts and so on because they've got a local council contract. It gives them the choice to become an independent celebrant and be able to charge what they're worth, because I think the hours that go into creating the personal ceremonies that people will be wanting in the future rather than the regulated words do involve quite a bit of extra work. So
a lot of work, yeah. A lot of celebrants will tell you, if you were to break it down into an hourly rate, we're on a pretty low fee, really. Different ceremonies take different levels of preparation, but yes, it does, as you say, take a lot of work to prepare a ceremony and make it really beautiful, personal, bespoke to the couple. But there is also the conflict of interest issue there. So I believe, from what I've read so far, that a person wouldn't be able to cross over between the different types of officiant. You would have to choose what type of officiant you want to be and stick within that boundary. That's what I understand.
Yeah, there's another slightly extraordinary mention of conflict of interest, in that the celebrant can't require the couple to use a particular supplier, for example. So a celebrant couldn't work closely with a particular photographer, and if you book me, you have to book them, or any other supplier. Presumably the same applies from the point of view of choice of venue, that it would be tricky for an independent officiant to be linked to just one venue. The idea is that you can go anywhere and there's no requirement for a couple to book something.
There is something in there about conflict of interest in terms of suppliers, that we couldn't say, okay, you have to have this photographer if you work with me, or vice versa. However, there is something in there that says a venue could choose to have a resident independent officiant if they wanted to. So I think that's a slightly separate issue. Yeah. But yes, there will be a little bit more regulation in place in terms of those kind of conflict of interests with suppliers. But I think that's relatively, you know, you don't get many cases of that as it is anyway.
Yeah. Great. So looking at the different parts of the wedding, so the preliminaries, first of all, this has been the bit that I think was the bane of everyone's life during COVID, when they had sorted all of their paperwork and it had expired, and they're then paying fees again, and they can't get in to see a registrar because the offices are closed, and now the registrars are busy conducting weddings, and so on. It seemed to go on and on. They've modernised that whole process.
It seems like they've really modernised it. So people will now be able to give their intention to marry online instead of having to do it in person, which is something that most people would say is way overdue, really, to just be able to go on and say, okay, I'd like to marry this person, do that online. Then after you've done that, they would conduct the registrar interviews, both together and separately, which I believe they do in ceremonies anyway, or for anybody who gives notice for a civil wedding, they do that anyway. And that's obviously to prevent things like sham marriages and forced marriages, that they have to go through that interview process. But they can do that, register their intention to marry online. And then during that, as part of that process, they're issued with a marriage schedule, and that schedule is the document that will carry them through the entire process. So it's really streamlined.
And one of the little sort of side effects of the change is something that I think is going to be quite sad to lose from weddings, and that is because the intention to marry is going to be published online. that it removes that requirement to have the open door policy, so that anyone can walk into a wedding at that moment of, you know, does anyone see any reason this couple shouldn't marry? We're not going to have that deathly silence while everyone, you know, doesn't breathe. And that was the only reason that there needed to be that public access. So it means weddings can be more private, which I think a lot of people are very, very keen to be moving that way.
Yeah, and I don't think the open door policy was relevant to all, I might be wrong, but I don't think it was relevant to all weddings anyway, even as it stands. But I think, yes, with civil weddings conducted by registrars, they do have to have that open door policy. And obviously that key moment of, does anyone here object to the marriage? But yes, it will. And obviously people who are already choosing to have celebrant-led ceremonies don't have that bit usually, and that's in their ceremony anyway, because it's not relevant, because they're not doing the legally binding bit. So yes, it will make ceremonies a lot more private and less kind of focused on the legal side of things.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, it was one of those lovely things that seeing the Law Commission, listening to people. I was in the meeting where they were discussing the fact that none of the registrars that they had spoken to had actually come across anyone that had stood up and gone, actually, yes, I object in for weddings and a funeral or whatever way. So yeah,
never in real life. I've certainly never seen it.
Absolutely. And obviously we've touched from the point of view of civil weddings, the preliminaries there. Simplification of bans as well. So it's going to be just bans read on 3 Sundays and a much shorter period there before Anglican weddings. And no requirement for them to be read in the church where the couple are planning to get married, just in the parishes where each party of the couple reside, which would mean that, you know, your name will be mentioned in your partner's church as well. But having said that, when I say no requirement for it also to be mentioned in the bans to be read in the hosting church, we may well see that happening, because one of the things that has been allowed for is for religious weddings to set their own requirements. So this is very much set out. This is the minimum that's required by law. But a lot of religious organisations will add additional layers on. So particular requirements of couples before the wedding or during the wedding. And also important for us just to note that same-sex marriages in religious buildings weren't covered by the terms of reference. So the Law Commission very specifically weren't asked to look at this in this piece of legislation. It was widely debated, and government made the decision on that. So that is one thing that that hasn't changed. The other thing that I think will be frustrating for a lot of couples where one of the couple has been divorced before, one of the other things not covered by the terms of reference is working out who is permitted to marry, particularly in church is the relevant one there. So moving on to other elements of the ceremony, we've talked about who decides where the ceremony can be. We've talked about open doors policy. What about the content of the ceremony? What still needs to be said? And does everyone have to say vows? What needs to be included?
So if the government did decide to include independent officiants and obviously humanist officiants as well in this law reform, then they would be for the first time conducting the legally binding side of the marriage, whereas currently we're not doing that, which is why we're able to make the ceremony a lot more personal to the couple. So because we would then be doing the legally binding side of the marriage, there would be some wording that we would have to get the couple to include in their vows. The Law Commission hasn't gone into detail about what that wording should be. They've left it quite open. So they've said it will be something along the lines of what it currently is, like, I take you, blah, 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 full name, to be my lawfully wedded wife, husband, something like that. Very simple. But then, of course, you can add your own bespoke, personalised, written vows, romantic vows on top of those. So it's not the case that you would just have to say those prescribed words and that's it. They've also said that you don't, although you should use those wordings, it's not a deal breaker if you didn't. So it's really about what's signed, the document, the schedule which is signed. So that's the schedule that's formed at the beginning when you register your intention to marry, and that follows you all the way through the process, to the through the ceremony where it's signed with 2 witnesses, and then to the registration of the marriage, which takes place within 21 days after the ceremony. So that's actually where the legally binding side of the marriage comes in, and the prescribed wording is just a little extra in the ceremony. But in terms of the content, if this was to go ahead, it just opens it up massively, because couples will be able to choose really any content that they want to, as long as the officiant agrees that it's seemly and dignified and in keeping with the seriousness of the commitment they're making. Then they'll really be allowed to include anything they want to in their ceremony. And that's just so, you know, that's what people have been crying out for such a long time. They want their ceremonies to be personal to them as a couple. They want to be able to have the option to include things that reflect their own beliefs, their own values, whether they be religious or spiritual. So it really does open it up to create really beautiful personalized ceremonies, and also make them legally binding as well.
And I think that's been the big restriction that has frustrated a lot of people, has been that requirement that there can't be any religious content if it's a civil wedding. And I don't think anyone could understand why you can't have, you know, I mean, at some weddings, Robin, you know, the angels, you know, being sung, because is that religious content? You know, it's kind of, come on.
Absolutely.
So yeah. And from the point of view of the vows, that makes it's, again, going back to a really logical approach that, yes, you're saying your vows in front of your witnesses, but actually the really important thing is that written document, the written contract, and, you know, everyone can understand. We've got a Toastmaster just commenting, it sounds like the content's what I include already. Yes, I think for a lot of weddings it is. Those that have been having independent celebrants but then getting married legally elsewhere, they have been doing that. But unfortunately there have been some couples that haven't necessarily realized they also need to have a legal wedding when they have had a ceremony that perhaps mixes elements and therefore isn't legal, and so it's going to completely end that. And then the final bit from the point of view of the wedding is the registration of the wedding afterwards, and getting that marriage certificate. And again, this has been simplified.
It's been simplified, yes. So as I said, the schedule that the couple is given at the beginning, so at the registration, not registration, sorry, the preliminary side of things, when they register their intention to marry, that will carry them through the process. And then I think what will have to happen is that the officiant that they've chosen to work with will have to take that schedule that's been signed by the couple and by the 2 witnesses and by themselves. They'll have to take that to the register office where the couple originally registered to marry within 21 days, I think it is 21 days of the ceremony, and then register that, and then the couple are officially married.
Superb. So much easier process right the way through, and all very clear. So yeah, no, we look forward to hopefully having this all confirmed. Now, from the point of view of what businesses are doing, so the Association of Independent Celebrants obviously looks after a lot of celebrants. Have you noticed a sort of big change recently of celebrants wanting to change the way they do things, more celebrants coming on board, a requirement for more training? What are you noticing with celebrants?
There has been quite a steady and rapid increase in the number of people who train to be independent celebrants, but that's been something that we've been seeing not just because of this report. That's been something we've been seeing quite steadily over the past 5 to 10 years, and really it's because so many more people are now aware of how wonderful a celebrant-led ceremony can be. They're seeing celebrant-led ceremonies themselves and thinking, wow, what a wonderful thing to do. I wonder if that's something that I would be able to do, and then going off to train to be a celebrant themselves. So yes, we are seeing quite an increase in the number of people who are becoming independent celebrants. And that's the other good thing that we think is really good about this proposed reform, is that it puts a bit of regulation in place in terms of who can be an officiant who can be an independent officiant. And although, you know, as the AOIC, we encourage people to have relevant training or relevant experience. So, for example, some people used to be members of the clergy and then they become celebrants, so don't necessarily train as celebrants, but have that relevant experience. But the vast majority have that training and qualifications in celebrancy. And we encourage continuing professional development to make sure that celebrants are doing a really good job for their couples and keeping up to date with what's going on in the industry. But there isn't that official regulation in place. And that's one of the really good things about this. So the General Register Office would be able to regulate independent officiants and make sure that they are, as they call it, fit and proper people to carry out wedding ceremonies.
Well, it's carrying out a really, really important ceremony, so quite right that that those regulations are there. And I know all of us really, really appreciated celebrants being there, particularly as we came out of lockdowns and the registrars were massively under pressure. And it gave that choice to couples. They could go ahead with weddings when they couldn't get registrars, perhaps, you know that, and you know, or when they couldn't get paperwork in place, they could at least have their celebration, their ceremony, and then sort the legalities out later. So it was such an important service. So thank you to you and all of the other celebrants that you were supporting. And,
thank you very much. Yeah, it was certainly a very busy time the last 2 years. Yeah, back in the registration service. Yeah, but it was
Absolutely.
great.
And in terms of venues, is this worrying for those that own wedding venues? Do you see a big change in what's going to happen from the point of view of the popularity of traditional wedding venues?
I don't think that it's necessarily worrying. So I think some venues that I've spoken to see this as quite a positive thing. So venues that are already licensed, where they've had to get that license for their building or for obviously they've changed the law now so that they can open up outdoor spaces in venues that are already licensed indoors. But venues that have to jump through hoops to get those licenses for their premises, they wouldn't have to do that anymore. Yeah. Because of course the license would be with the officiant and not with the premises. So that's a real positive for venues that don't have to go through that process anymore. It does, however, open up, you know, if this goes ahead, then it opens up a huge amount of alternative locations for marriage ceremonies. So there will be an increase in people who just want to get married in their back garden, or just want to get married in a field or a woodland. I say just, I mean, they're wonderful places to get married, but you know, so that for wedding venues, they will just need to be aware of that there'll be a lot more competition. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think most venues that I've spoken to have are very much the opinion that the good venues have been there long before approved premises were a thing. So we had wedding venues before 1995 when civil weddings came in, and they were used for receptions. And a lot of venues would actually argue that the one thing that they really can't make any money on out of a wedding, you know, it's really hard to make it commercially viable to hold the actual ceremony, because it's a big room that needs to be left open for quite a long time, very specifically for the ceremony. They can't serve drinks in there. There's nothing that will be income generating as a result. So they're having to have this sort of otherwise pretty pointless room there, and that won't be required anymore. And I think the other really key thing is, yes, it sounds absolutely wonderful to have your wedding on a beach, in a field, in a forest, but we've got to be we've got to be practical. We're in England and Wales, we're talking about here. It rains a lot, or it's blisteringly hot, and on a day like today, if you had planned a wedding on a beach, you're going to want to be there in the cool, in an air-conditioned building, able to enjoy being at a wedding, not melting. So I think, you know, having that backup plan is always going to be there. But I think what we're probably going to see a lot more of is the venues that have got beautiful outside spaces that perhaps don't have a roof on, so very much as they are now, really having the confidence to invest in those walled gardens, those rose gardens, to make them really beautiful, special places, but within reach of a venue to dash guests back to after.
There always needs to be a plan B.
Yeah, yeah. And somebody was just asking about whether there's going to be a fee for independent officiants to be licensed. Those are the sort of details that are still being ironed out, and I think we can be pretty confident there would be, but I know one of the things that they were looking at, it was the cost was prohibitive for venues, for smaller venues, and what they don't want is just to have a few incredibly busy officiants, because it costs thousands to get licensed. So at the moment, most venues are paying somewhere between 1,000, some of them 4,000. It varies from area to area, but it's a big difference, and also it's a hefty fee. So you wouldn't ever sensibly license a venue specifically for one wedding, and I think exactly the same will apply for this, that will be addressed for this, in that they'll want to make sure it's affordable, and it's probably more important for officiants to be investing in their training and that to be a requirement rather than the hefty fee. So I'd imagine admin.
Yes, that's right. I mean, and there was some really interesting research that was done, I think it was in 2020, amongst independent celebrants, and they did ask them, would you be willing to pay a fee if it meant that you could do the legal marriage, and had to be registered by the General Register Office, or some sort of governing body? And the vast majority, something like 95%, said yes, they would be prepared to pay. I think it was something up to £500 for that registration process, and also an annual fee for their continuing professional development, which is something that would also be quite important. So, celebrants take their jobs very, very seriously, and therefore are willing to invest in their careers and invest to make sure that they're doing the best job for the couples that they work with. So I don't think the fee thing would be an issue, but as you say, it's not going to be too much to go through that process. But yeah, there probably will be some sort of fee involved.
And I think we learnt during COVID that it took 2 weeks to train a registrar, and that covers marriage as well as all of their other duties, so christenings, funeral, and all of their other duties. So I don't imagine the training is going to be too onerous, but what's going to be lovely to see, as you say, that commitment to CPD that I think we're seeing from celebrants right the way across the board, humanist and independent, all of these people just wanting to make weddings really, really special, really, really individual, and give couples the freedom. And I think that's probably a really good point to end on. If anyone has any questions, we will try to work through the questions and answer them all individually. So do feel free to add questions in the chat. We'll both keep an eye on that. But for now, Sophie, it's been lovely speaking to you about something so positive. I think while, the last time that we spoke online was probably in the middle of the restrictions, when we were talking about all of the things that we couldn't do. So this is really, really nice to be seeing such a massively positive step forward for weddings. So thank you very much for joining me on such an important topic.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much. And speak to you soon, hopefully.
Thanks very much.
Goodbye.